So for you, I just the concept of like
Having
friends.
to, yeah. That's the thing. I got this one for months and months ago. And I haven't found a frame that will fit it. I've got several frames. I tried to put it in.
Ruth's been messaging me about the turkeys.
Hello, how are you today?
You want it the same?
Yeah.
I think we're socially distanced on the seats.
Yeah,
I think we're in the same bubble at this point.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that way we have the little shelf here for our.
It's like a silver seats.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone's asking that, and I don't know why.
It's a mystery. It's a total mystery. I would personally have been unconscious. But, you know, it's okay. You're not late.
I mean, I was like, just still in the family. Just sort of put in.
Yeah, it's good. Octavia's so no.
When are you speaking to?
I'm going to feel it, sorry.
Sitting nice and close to the YouTube picture as well, so you get that nice.
I was watching this thing about books. They have for TV and probably like for paperbacks, they have specially made vinyl bags so it doesn't. Yeah. Interesting.
I never thought about it live streaming.
It's best not to think about it.
Yeah.
It's not
Let's
even
not
like
forget about it right now.
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't realise most of the way through yesterday. And then I think there was an error on the screen. So.
You're like, thank you.
Four.
Do you want me to do for the safety briefing? I think everybody knows where everything is. Nothing's changed. Just got one more participant coming. She's just in the toilet. So enjoy this session. Thank you. Give me one comment.
Romantic horror. It is. Yeah.
I think you can argue that you're in that.
Yeah.
It's not how I primarily classify it, but I think you could argue it's romantic horror.
There's an increasing number of romance books that cross over. Read a few recently.
All the gothic stuff.
Yes, lots of gothic stuff. Yeah, I read Saw Kill Kill Girls recently, which was gorgeous horror and romantic. Yeah, for Valentine's Day this year. Valentine's Day, it was this year.
Oh, it's so long ago.
Yeah, February back last year. It's a lot to it feels like a lot. Yeah.
Well, let's all get started. Kelly Copeland, thank you everyone for coming this morning to our panel on horror writing. Called me Hodgkinson, my name is Mary Hodgkinson. I'm a publisher at Hart Press, and I also write as well.
Hi, I'm Melanie. I'm a speculative fiction writer and author. I write a little bit of horror and dark fantasy. I also write science fiction and straight fantasy. I was an assistant editor on this horror and dark fiction anthology that we put out this year called Black Dogs, Black Tales, and was also the New Zealand Writer Liaison on New Zealand, which is the world science fiction convention that Wellington hosted this year, and maybe so horror elements to it.
Not all fictional. I'm Cassie, otherwise known as JC Hart, or Cassie Hart here, or JC Hart on the inside, as well as Margaret Blake, and I write a little bit of absolutely everything, but most of what I write has creepy / horror elements in it because I love horror. I'm maybe the only one on the panel who can say that wholeheartedly. I love horror. But I'm not good at remembering book titles, so I will get some recommendations from you all. Yeah, I worked on this one as well, and it's me. Is it? Yeah.
We are we're here to talk about modern horror writing, but to start with, let's step back in time a bit and talk about the first horror story that each of us read or watched, because horror is sort of a huge film medium. Start this year.
We were talking about this last night, and I was saying that I hadn't really read any horror until quite recently, but then Octavia pointed out that The Witch's Spiral Hotel is quite horrific. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, that it's one of the few books that I read as a child where I can remember where I was when I read it. Like I can picture my bedroom around me, and I can remember reading it all the way through, and sitting and the feeling of disturbance that I had. So I guess that's, that one actually did sink with me to the point where I can still feel and see what the process of reading it was.
I read a lot of horror. Celeste Bookclub was my friend. So I read all of the science of the Goosebumps, the Fear Street, and the Midnight 13 kind of books. And the story that I can remember earliest reading is one where there was a woman who had a choker on, and she couldn't take it off, and her husband kept pestering her about it, and then one night he takes it off and her head rolls off onto the floor. And I remember that still.
I don't think the whole time you're
I should not be saying that's one of the first ones I think, when I think back, that's one of the first stories that really stuck with me. Oh, and the one, where the dog licks the fingers under the bed, and then she does it for comfort. She puts her hand down, and the dog licks her finger, and then she goes to get a drink, and like the dog's head is in the fridge or something because the camera isn't under her bed.
That's another aspect
That's an
of horror,
urban
which was like the sleepover horror story.
Yes.
Yeah,
Old
I think,
school.
yeah,
Kind of
yeah,
urban legend type things, yeah.
yeah, it's like another big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a few, but those kind of stories, the ones I most remember for the novel.
I too was a major Goosebumps fan, and I particularly remember the Scholastic Club Goosebumps subscriptions that came with props. So there's that one or several Goosebumps books about like the blob that eats things, and then if you ordered it through Scholastic, you get this little plastic tub of that advertised that you could put dead bugs in it and it would dissolve them. Which was amazing. Like 7 years old, you're like, yes, and your parents are like, but the book that stuck with me the most, and the title has not stuck with me, the author has not stuck with me, but what has stuck with me is the cover and this one image from it, which is often the way I find with horror, is that one image like you'd roll away.
Yeah.
Your sort of full experience. It's a story, and this young boy lives near to a research facility where some genetic engineering is taking place, which is really something. And some of the experiments escape from this facility, and the mice that have become a hive mind, so that the mice can sort of clamber up on each other, Voltron robot style, and become a giant quivering white mass that eats people. So that's what I remember. And I couldn't even look at that book after I'd read it. I was like, I don't think I like it anymore. If it was on the bookshelf, I would be like lying there in bed, knowing exactly where it was on the bookshelf. Oh God. So that book had to leave the house. What are your favourite types of horror? Because horror is a genre that contains a lot of subgenres, levels of.
I like most horror. I think the horror that spooks me out the most is like body horror. So I don't tend to. I read recently a short story collection by Betty Rocksteady, and oh my goodness, some of the things that she does are just, it's way out there. Some of it's amazing and beautiful, and some of it's just like, what the hell did I just read? There's a couple stories in there, but I'm just like, I'm a little bit traumatized over that kind of body horror. But I particularly love things that mess with your head. I really like when you're not sure if it's real or if it's imagined. I quite like psychological horror. So yeah, a little bit more subtle than the slasher flicks, which I still do like still. But yeah, that's probably my favourite kind is I really like it when I write a horror story and people get to the end and go, ooh, and or like, oh, and just kind of don't really have an appropriate response. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, just that bit of a sucker punch and that brain messing around kind of horror.
Yeah, I think so. I do like horror, but I don't like all horror. And the stories that I'm drawn to are often the ones that the ones where I can see meaning and where I get maybe empathy and a sense of identity of the person that's writing them. So stories like Shiva's Sorja was laughing, and that insight into colonialism. Stories about trans and gender diverse characters, where I think that you get a much greater insight into what someone else is feeling by reading about the things that they're scared of and that horrify them, their lived experience that is that can be a horror in itself. Laura Gray's Shadow, I don't know if it's quite counts as horror, but that was a really the stuff that I love is stuff that's clever and plays with form. So there's a whole bunch of short fiction now that is, it's like annotations on footnotes and it's quizzes and it's just lots of different playful ways where and it's like this conversation between the reader and the writer because you don't get the whole sense of the story from it. You have to imagine what is going on and what the effect of it is on the character because it's in this different form. So
Which is a very effective way of writing horror, is
Yeah.
letting the reader sort of fill in the gaps.
yeah, and probably what they're coming with is more horrific than you might have.
speak directly to
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a good example of that, playing with form especially, is House of Leaves, which I don't know anyway, it's huge, like the book is massive, but the type is all over this footnotes, and it's a story within a story within a story, and it's complicated and amazing, like it's phenomenal, and it does take quite a lot of work to get through the book, but that's kind of, there's lots of different forms in there, and the type does cool things at different places as well, but that's a really good kind of horror book that plays with form and delivers it in a different, not in a straight up kind of way. You know, it's a cool one. But yeah.
Gosh. As you might have been able to tell from my story about the book that stuck with me, I'm a bit of a wuss. I would generally say that I don't like any horror at all, but I'm more than that I actually do enjoy it. So I enjoy horror films, and I've realised that the horror films that I enjoy the most tend to be those that are playing with or in conversation with those horror tropes. Like the classic is Scream. It's probably the first horror movie that I watched before I even realised that it was taking on these tropes. But more recently, movies, films like Tuck and Dale versus Evil, which is a horror comedy, and as an aside, I also think it's really interesting how horror and comedy work really well together so frequently. And so Tuck and Dale versus Evil is a film that takes the sort of trope of the creepy hillbilly in American horror films and turns it on its head that our main characters, Tuck and Dale, are, working class white Americans out of the sticks. They've just, they've been saving so hard, and they've just bought this rundown cabin in the woods, and they've just moved in to start doing it up and doing some fishing and hunting, and a bunch of young American co-eds come and start dying in horrible ways in their holiday house. So it's horrible. There's lots of decapitation and people going into the wood chipper and all of that. Another one similar is Cabin in the Woods.
Oh yeah,
which
just
is
the ultimate. Yeah.
it's so good, which I didn't know what I was going into it. So I'm honestly just really great. I'm also a big fan of haunted house stories. I think what I really like about them is that there's often a puzzle and sort of a historical. You're trying to find out, or the characters are very desperately trying to find out what is going on, why these things are happening, and what the story is of the horrible thing that happened that is causing things to happen.
Yeah, so as I remember as a kid playing Mist and Ribbon, did anyone play those computer games? And there's no one else in this game, but you wander around these rooms and these areas, various areas of this island, and it's just this creepy music, and you have to solve these puzzles, and then you get these really disturbing little snippets of videos and stuff.
Yeah.
That was
There's some
fantastic.
good modern takes on it. Dear Easter, you kind of arrive on an island and there is no one around, and you basically can only walk around. That's all you can do is walk and look closely at things, and it tells a story as you discover new paths, and that's kind of beautiful, haunting in a way. And another one that my kids adore, especially my youngest, she just has played it so many times, and I'm really starting to think of the name. It's got really beautiful storytelling, and it's about a family who die, and basically you are exploring all of the different deaths, so you're playing all of these characters' lives till when they die, and then you go back into you're like unlocking a family tree, which is really gorgeous. It's absolutely stunning, but it plays gets into lots of horror films, and we follow around this house trying to unlock all the mysteries. So that kind of,
Yeah. What is the game called?
I don't know.
It was part of what I loved about getting in the night. So I loved the house exploring and the puzzles in it. Gave me the exact same sense. She must have made this to like there's times when she's describing these things and walking into this room.
Yeah.
There's no one else there and there's the bed in the cupboard. You've got to find that. So totally play this game. Love it.
Yeah. So I think in general, mysteries and horror are dealing with problem solving and trying to figure out what is going on is a big draw for lots of horror.
Do we think it undermines it at all? The idea that horror is something that can be figured out and maybe escaped, or is that just my wussy self being like, if I can understand all the crazy shit that's going on, I can escape it?
I don't know. I think there's definitely a place for that in horror. Like there's a whole chunk of horror that has those when people survive, they make it out the other side, and that's important. I also really like when they make it out and then they die. No, but that's just me.
That is the Goosebumps thing. Isn't it? That's the penultimate chapter of every Goosebumps book.
Yeah.
At least one of the main characters of
Yeah,
that story
you
has
banish this thing,
got
but then
out,
the
that's
brother's
right,
eyes
and
blow
then the
green.
master came back.
Yeah, because I think that's another element of horror is that horror it can be defeated, but never really goes away. Like there's always going to be something else. But that's kind of like you can use it as a mechanism for dealing with life as well. Is that we have lots of tragedies and horrific things can happen, and we can get through them, and that's great. But there's always going to be. As 2020 has delivered, there's more horrific things around the corner. So I think that's
Horror favourite bit of horror right now. 2020.
Throw the book out. It's improbable.
So that brings me on to talk about you like it when they escape and end up which is a big horror trope, right? So would you like to talk a bit about favourite and least favourite horror tropes? The ones where you get to that page and you're like, oh, this, we like, ooh, this, this group of half a dozen people are going into the horror
I think
old laboratory.
As from a personal point of view, my least favourite thing in horror is when there is, I have bipolar 2 myself, so when there's a bipolar character and then all of a sudden they have split personality disorder. And that really, really annoys me because it's like they already have a thing. And it's not the same thing. Stop conflating different mental health things with each other. Sure, sometimes people have multiple things going on, but it's not typically the norm. So I think it really annoys me as a reader when it's kind of lazy and like they're not actually doing the research and it's kind of like, oh, that feels kind of lazy to me.
There's lying on stereotypes.
Yeah. So I think that's probably one of my least favourite things. But also when something says it's going to do a thing and then it tries to be clever and twists it in a really unsuccessful way. And I can't think of any things off the top of my head. Oh no, I did. I read a book recently called The House and it was horribly disappointing because I thought that it was either going to be a, they drive over nails in the car, they can't drive their car, and they end up at this old house, and it was going to be beautiful and creepy. But then they introduced the kind of, hick family, and then they kept introducing kind of different elements, and it wasn't successful to me in the way that it all came together. So I think sometimes people can try and play with too many things and not end up delivering on the one thing they promised to. Was promised a house. It was the house. Wasn't the house. It's the title of the book. So that's probably my least favourite. You can say your least favourite while I think about my favourite.
I was trying to think of the stories. So we read a lot of over 200 stories about black dogs. Black dogs, black tails, and horror anthology. None of the dogs died, which is great. But I think the thing that I struggled, or the stories that I most struggled with were like sometimes horror is like you write it for catharsis and to explore complex emotions and stuff, but you can kind of tell the difference between when someone is just glorifying self-harm and suicide for shock value versus someone who has actually experienced that and it has, the story feels like it's saying something, it's meaning even if forward saying, this is what my lived experience is, this is what it means to me. And so, yeah, I think the biggest issue I have with some horror stories is just horror for horror's sake, and just coming up with those those shocking and traumatizing situations with no just understanding.
Yeah, speaking about the suspicion they got, I remember there was one with that kid who was being abused by a horrible, awful mother who was so horribly awful and stereotypical. There was like no depth in the family, no kind of development about anything. It was basically horrible people being horrible to children who horribly murders everyone. Kind of, like it doesn't really say a whole lot about anything. Like, so I think
But it didn't have the emotional depth.
No, there was no
or reason.
emotional depth,
It wasn't like
just like horrible.
empower the victim to
No,
overcome. It was just
horrible.
this will be a shocking thing to write down.
Because I think horror is most effective when there is that emotional
Yeah,
connection
yeah.
with the situation or the character, and you're like,
Yes,
you know, if it's
it's
just
all about
processing,
the emotions and
it's
the
like-
feelings that it.
I think it really does have to have that emotional impact. And also, I think some of my favourite things in horror are when I can't read. When stuff is unfolding and you're like, I'm just waiting, my whole body tenses up, and I'm just waiting for that release. I'm the person who goes to a horror movie and I jump at every jump scare, like every time, even if I know it's coming, because something's wrong with me. I don't know. It's a question I've been asked many
My
times.
favourite one is when the character is like in the bathroom and there's nothing in the mirror, and then they're like,
yeah.
and then they'll go, and there's something there.
Yeah, I think one of the appealing things about horror is that build up of anxiety and then the release. Like that release you get, even if it's not a very pleasant necessarily thing happening on the screen, it feels good. Or I'm just weird. But yeah, no, I do.
Comedy comes into that as well. So when you have a horror comedy movie with a novel story, and it keeps you really off balance. You have that tension that's come out and like, it's going to be like horrible, or is it going to be funny, or is it going to make me like laugh at something horrible? Which is another way of amping up that suspense for the reader.
Yeah, I think suspense is quite important, and the atmosphere, I love the atmosphere that so much good horror kind of evokes. It just, my favourite tropes are, it's still really hard. I love so many of them. I actually, when I was writing my novel, Butcher Bird, I actually went on to the TV Tropes website, which is fantastic. If anyone's writing things, they have tropes about everything. Looked up different horror tropes, and you almost don't recognise all the things that are tropes until you see them all there, and you're like, whoa, that's what that's called. So I went through and I was like, oh yeah, I want to do stuff in the swamp, and I want to do this, and I want to do, so I found all of these tropes I wanted to play with in my book, and that was a really fun way to write. I've done that quite a lot actually with TV tropes. I had another book I wrote, I wanted to write a maze, and I did a maze, and it was really fun. I'm just like, what things do I want to write about, and then find the tropes that kind of play with those, and then you can, because even though people say they don't like cliches and tropes, in actual fact, part of why we read genre fiction, in particular horror, is to get those certain feelings about things. And so if you're going into writing a thing intentionally wanting to play with people, in a nice way, maybe not always in a nice way, but evoke certain responses, it can be helpful to know what is expected, so you can either deliver on that or twist it in an effective way.
And tropes have to build tension as
They
well.
do.
Like, that's why you go, oh my gosh,
Yes.
you know something's going to come.
Yes,
in the
yeah.
middle.
All these cues. It's like the music in the movies. It tells you something's coming, and you can do that with writing as well. It's like, you've got that feeling in your gut.
And they run into the forest and you're like,
Join into the This is the perfect segue for us to talk about horror in our own writing. So, Cassie, would you like to start off? You already started talking about it with finding those tropes.
Yeah, I think because I grew up reading so much horror, I can't kind of get away from it. I don't try very hard, to be honest, because I really like reading it, so I like writing it. Most of my short stories are horror or have strong horror elements, but I don't think that means they have to be like Taika, which was in Years Best last year. That's a horror story, but it's also really beautiful. Like, to me, it felt like a really beautiful story, and I tell people that it's horror and it's beautiful, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" But I think that's entirely possible. Like, I don't think those two things have to be separate. I think you can do all sorts of things. Yeah, so everything I write has creepy kind of elements to it on some level, even when I don't think they do. Other people are like, "Oh, that was really creepy." What are you talking about? That wasn't creepy. I wasn't trying to. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. So I don't know. For me, it's quite hard to avoid that that edge of darkness in most of my writing, and so now I don't really try. Just dive in and own it. Yeah.
Yeah. When I only started writing in 2016, and sometime in 2018 I just decided that I was going to try and write a horror story, having not really read that much of it, and it was as much like an intellectual puzzle exercise for my brain. It was like, here's a new thing that I can try out, and it totally sucks you in. Like, it's like it starts leaching into everything else that I'm writing.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the time people don't think about certain things as horror, but they have all the elements of horror. And so much of life does have horror in it. And we were talking earlier, like, I went through a phase of years and years where all my horror was about pregnancy and motherhood, because I was having children at the time, and I love my children more than life itself, but oh my god, parenting is hard and challenging, and when you have a baby, your whole body feels like there's an alien inside it, and there's all these things that you can only really explore through fiction. So I did have years of one of the first stories I had published, well, the first story I had published, which was 10 years ago now, in a foreign country, Birthrights, which is still one of my favourite stories. But I was pregnant at the time it was published, and my oldest daughter was in primary school, and I got my book, and my friends wanted to read it, and it's about controlling who gets to have children and who doesn't, and the main character who's running the tests on the pregnant mothers is reflecting on how if the test had been happening when she was pregnant, she probably wouldn't have passed, because parenting is hard and it's challenging. But every time I lent the book to someone and they read it, I was like, I'm not judging you. I'm not judging. This is not, like, I would not be this government that is doing this thing. But it was really, like, it was a thing felt like I needed to explore, like, who, yeah. So this is not my personal opinion. I've had other stories I've written where people are like, oh, she's an ecological terrorist. I'm like, I'm not. I'm really nice, honestly. This is not me. This is an idea that I'm exploring, but it's not necessarily my opinions or beliefs. So I think that's always. And no, don't people say that to Stephen King? Like, are you a serial killer? We're all bodies. Like, just because we write a thing, it doesn't mean we are that thing, or we've experienced that thing, or that's the thing.
Like, I'm pretty sure he still has Moses.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. What do you do with that stalker fan? Yeah. So I think it's certainly a thing with horror. Sometimes people raise their eyebrows, like, we'll just explore it as a way to explore ideas. And so much of parts of life are quite horrific that as a writer, natural instinct is to explore that idea. And the way I do that, some people do it with art or music. I do it with words.
Yeah, it's funny. I was looking at what's the stories that I've published that would fit into the horror genre, and they sort of fall into two camps, and one of them is definitely motherhood. I wrote this tiny little poem that was all about the sentient supermarket that just feeds on the tantrums of children.
That's awesome.
Because they put those damn sweets right.
Yes.
Bloody
High level.
exit to the supermarket when you can't get out. Without. And then I wrote another little piece of microfiction that was called Red Rubber, and it was about postnatal depression and the state monitoring the emotions of new mothers, and when they were being out, it sort of had actually something that looked a bit, and it changed colour, and if you got severely depressed, they would take your child away. It's probably going to take longer to explain than the 99 words the story is. And it's like on one level it's just sci-fi, and someone reviewed it and actually got completely confused about why they were like, what is it? This is like horrible, but I don't understand. But if the person was really depressed, then I was like, oh wow, this is obviously only going to speak to others.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then the other group that my writing falls into is apparently eyeballs. Lots of stories where there's either eyeballs that are getting gouged out and eaten, or like eyeballs is like, I think it's the idea of like looking into someone's personality or identity.
Eyes are a little bit to the side.
Yeah. I wrote a story that was a harmless for these studies 4 years ago, and it was like eyeballs growing on creepy trees, and if you ate them, then the personality traits that were of the people that those eyeballs had grown from, like as a person that ate them. Yeah. So I
I don't
guess
think I've eaten any eyeballs, so just
no,
in case.
it makes for a really great gross description. So yeah, so I think in my writing, yeah, you explore the stuff that is kind of his to you, right? So it's kind of identity. Yeah, eyeballs. Yeah. Have you written?
I haven't written any horror, but I'm working on a project at the moment which I'm going to describe as cozy horror. So it's going to draw on horror elements, particularly the idea of horrifying interdimensional beings,
Oh,
with
cool.
sort of unformed edges and constantly changing. But it's just going to be like really cute as well. But like you say, when you're talking about you writing what just seems like a beautiful story, and someone else reads it and runs away screaming. I have to get some people to test it first to make sure I've got the balance.
I'll read it.
I'm
going to tell you it's cute.
No, you won't be a biased reader.
I might be slightly.
I love those stories that mix the genres together and you just get horror elements along with everything else. Like I think Sasha Stronach's The Dawn Hounds, like he described it to me once, it's genre queer and it seems to sort of work its way through a whole range of genres. I think it's very horror to understand.
Yeah, but I think sometimes when you want to deliver meaningful horror, the best way to do it is not in a horror book. Like sometimes people, I mean, for a long time people thought of horror it has to be grand slash flick, or it has to be really gory or bloody. But I think these days horror can be a lot more subtle and can talk about a lot of things, especially when layered on other genres.
I loved The Boys. Is that the super
TV show? Yeah.
Have you watched season 2?
Yeah. Sorry.
So it takes like classic sort of superhero Marvel thing, it just brings in all these horror
So
elements.
many things.
So many, like super gory, but also like really just disturbing relationships
Oh,
that make you
really
totally
disturbing
creeped out. And
relationships,
it's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does a
And
really
also
good job.
very violent.
Very violent.
So, Cassie and Mel have talked a bit this morning about the book, Black Dollars, Black Tails. So, I think I'll now give them an opportunity to talk a bit about it, their stories, and do additional reading. Cassie, could you introduce where the book came from, what's the name?
Because my name's and my name's
Yeah.
So our mutual friend Tabitha Wood came up with the idea for this book, which is Black Dogs, Black Tails, where the dogs don't die. Was a very important part, and we raised money for Mental Health New Zealand. So horror, they're all mostly horror.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just
all
dark
dark stuff, but also not all unhopeful. We had about 200 short stories to read through, and we ended up with 17-ish. Something like that. There's some poems and some drawings as well, which was really cool. It was.
I was quite surprised at the range of stories that we managed to find, because it was such a specific like there must be a black dog, and there's kind of the suggestion that because it's raising funds for mental health, that like a lot of the stories
Some mental health elements to them, but definitely not all of them by any means.
but they've all taken it in a different way, and the dogs are all, they range from
vampire
hellhounds and
dogs,
thieves,
and
but some
saving
of it
dogs.
saviors and protectors and
Yeah.
just friends, but there's so many. Yeah, I'm surprised that we managed to get the range that we
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
With such a
The scope was smaller, but the range of stories. I think it's one of the really fascinating things about writing is that
I just wonder if anyone shows what's leave in and what's leave out. I mean, is that difficult? Kind of worked your way down from 200.
no, because you get the chunk that don't read the submission guidelines and see something to not read anyway, so they're immediately out. And then you get a lot of things that you can tell are not going to be they're not quite there yet. They need some work. Like we might really like the story idea, but actually probably needs a couple more things at the end.
I think we probably did it quite in a way that I would think. Like we had
There were 10, 8, probably 8.
of us that read every single story anonymously,
And we
had
rated
them
them
in
in a spreadsheet.
It was like yes, maybe.
Yes, no, maybe. and at the end of it, we had, there weren't many.
It's kind of interesting. There were only maybe 3 or 4 that had almost everyone say yes to.
Yeah.
And then there were a bunch where there were like a couple of
Yeah, but lots more yeses than, it was kind of clear from where we had with the yeses that there was enough there to have good discussion about what would go in and what would stay out. And then I think we ended up with 4 or 5 that we needed to read through and pick a couple out of,
Yeah.
because they were kind of in the middle of.
There was one more slot that we had to fill.
Yeah.
At the end.
Which one? Which one's going
And
to
that was interesting because that's the one that we struggled the most with. It was from that to we had 16 maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, she was 17.
Because we're trying like 17% of people in New Zealand are diagnosed with some sort of depression or mental illness, so we're trying to mirror that. But that last slot was
Was the
quite
hardest
difficult
of
to fill, so I think it's kind of an indication of when you're reading that level of slush, the percentage that are going to
Kind of any of them could have gone in, and I think it
Yeah.
was down to we just let Tabitha decide which one she preferred to go in, because it was too hard to kind of say this one is definitely better than this one. But we actually, it was amazing. Out of all the ones that ended up in the yes column, there wasn't much crossover in story content, which was quite phenomenal, really, considering.
There wasn't, we didn't really have any discussions about
We've already got one like that.
Yeah.
So.
Tabitha is also a wonderful that
She does great.
South, and she has a story as well. There's a collection out
Well,
Darklands over Wellington, which is stories that feature rules of coffee, gay parties and stuff.
do you go first or?
Sure.
Oh yeah, I'm going to give this copy away to somebody.
Somebody in this room.
Yeah. What do we?
Okay, so I think we decided, so you have to think about this while we're reading. Whoever can do the best horror recommendation. So it doesn't have to be the best book ever, but your description of it.
And we're
Has to
open
convince
to
us that you're
movies, TVs, or book, TV shows,
Yeah.
or books.
So starts with your horror. Modern horror.
Yeah.
Those things. Okay. So I am going to read from my story, Victor's Tales. It's not particularly subtle.
I really like it.
I was
One of my favourite, my top 3 in the book.
and I did write it after we started. It was all done anonymously, so I promise I didn't cheat my way into the anthology. But I did have the advantage of having read all the stories and gone, what's the gap here? And what I was trying to do was capture the whole concept of an anthology that included black folks or together because a lot of the stories have some of those elements. So I'm going to read from the start of my story. It's called Synesthete. The first time I remember noticing a flash in someone's eyes was the day I started preschool. The shadow of black and red in the teacher's eyes matched the feathers lining the korowai cloak of the girl sitting next to her, who was leaving that day to start school. I thought that was clever. flashes had always been miracles, in the eyes of my parents and adults who came to visit. When I was old enough to wonder, I thought they must be spirit animals, guardians perhaps. I was oblivious in the way that many children are, or maybe I just didn't want to see. I can remember the first time I looked in the mirror to search my own out, staring into the depths of my eyes and feeling a moment of panic that there was nothing there, before I saw the shadowed outline, the hint of movement from the rise and fall of its breath. I shouted at the mirror to try and wake it, but it did not stir. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd succeeded in waking it that day. It was only when I closed my eyes and saw the after image on my eyelids that I could make out the shape. A hound, as black as my pupils, curled in sleep. It wasn't until puberty hit that I started to realise the truth. Scotty was the first boy I thought I wanted to kiss. I didn't tell anyone because all the girls wanted to kiss him and it was ridiculous to think he might pick me. I just stared at the back of his head in class, admired the casual swagger that somehow came across even when he was sitting still. And then the party. Those first gulps of cheap and burning vodka. Stumbling into a bedroom and there he was, his casual swagger now a stagger, his hands pulling me closer, the sudden sickening realization that I did not want this. I pushed him away in panic. No, I've seen the way you look at me, he slurred. I shook my head and stepped back. Freak. My stomach churned with dread, and my frantic eyes met his, searching for a sign that this would not make my life over, that I would be able to show my face at school on Monday. The thing is, I didn't usually meet people's eyes. Somewhere between kindergarten and that party, I'd realised no one else saw the flashes and had decided I wouldn't see them either. I watched their mouths instead, the twitch of hidden amusement at one corner or the downturned edges of lost passions. Maybe I would have been prepared if I had been watching eyes all those years, if I had let myself accustom to my changing sight. I stared into Scotty's eyes and I saw the rabid peacock tearing at his brain, clawed feet scratching gouges down his amygdala as its sharp beak wrenched at optic nerves stretched so tight his eyes might pop out the back of the sockets. The bird's majestic iridescent wings spread wide, blood-stained and razor-sharp as they beat within his skull, slicing the soft tissues like the cutty grasses that used to catch our unwary arms as we walked to the beach. I stood in that room and I screamed, and I didn't stop screaming until the ambulance came. I couldn't show my face at school that Monday, or any Monday after. It was weeks before I could even step foot outside my room, weeks before I could bring myself to cry on my mother's shoulder. I watched her mouth as I crept out into the lounge. I saw her fear for me in the tightness of her lips. I heard the tentative tremor in her voice, the uncertainty that she might say the wrong thing and make it worse. I kept my eyes down, scared of the coloured flashes lurking higher. I sat beside her and leaned my head on her shoulder. I felt the comforting weight of her arm around me. I couldn't see her face from there. I was safe. I love you, she whispered. I didn't say anything. I could feel a tendril creeping down my face, caressing me. Each time it pulled away, I felt pinpoints of my cheeks stretched outwards one by one, tiny circles of pain. Not a tendril, but a tentacle. I jerked upright to stare at her, despite knowing better. I didn't notice the metallic reflections of the octopus's eyes within hers at first. I was too distracted by its tentacles tearing off the features of her face to shove them into its beak. I could see glimpses of her flesh further in, pieces of her nose and ears being ground down by a tongue covered in frozen teeth. I tore myself away and ran back to my room, the sound of her voice calling out to me muffled by the squelching of those tentacles rending her faceless. I could feel a sickening movement in my eyes, the first stirrings of a slumbering animal. I broke every mirror in the house.
Tell me, Joel, I know what happens next.
You'll have to find it. We'll win it.
Alright. Alright. My I'm going to read from The Dead Bay, which was first published in Baby Teeth, which Marie put out from the press.
2013.
Yeah, it was a while ago, and that was a collection of horror. What's the right word? Inspired by the creepy things that children say. And my daughter gave me the title for this. We used to live at the top of the hill, and in the bottom of the valley that we drove down was a dead end, and we drove past it one day, and she said, "What's down the dead way, honey?" And I was like, what is down a dead way? And I spent probably 6 years wondering about that until I wrote this story. So this one's the next big kid. It is one of my motherhood books.
So good.
It was awfully quiet, too quiet for the life of my child. I padded down the hallway and poked my head into Sadie's room to find her staring at the window. "Hey, what's up?" I crossed the room when she didn't turn and out beside her on the bed, my swollen belly coming between us. "Sadie?" She shook her head, making her dark hair shimmer, then she shuddered and unlatched her gaze from the street before turning towards me. "I'm sorry, Mummy." I frowned and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. "What for?" A line of tears marched slowly filed in her cheek, and she wiped them away before they reached her chin. "It's Hugo, he's gone." A flutter of panic beat in my chest. Hugo had been my closest companion since before I met Sadie's dad, before she'd been born. The dog was getting old now, but still. "What do you mean, he's gone?" He's got out the gate, he went down the dead way, and he's not coming back." Sadie bit her lip and gave another little shudder. I sighed in relief. "It's a dead end, sweetie, because it doesn't go anywhere, remember?" "But it does go somewhere." The depth of her eyes spoke of things I wasn't unable to grasp. I shook off the finger of fear that was tracing my spine and stood. "Daddy's going to be home soon, and then I'm going to go and look for Hugo. He won't have gone far." No, Mummy, you can't." She sprang from the bed and latched onto my legs, her head buried in my side. "I won't be gone long. I'll take his treats and he'll come back. Don't worry." "You can't go down the dead way, Mummy. They want you to." At least that's what I thought she said. I tried to prise her off, but she was doing a perfect impression of a limpet. The door slammed downstairs and I sighed, tugging her up my body until she was nestled against my shoulder. Her leg hooked over the curve of my bum. "Come on, Daddy's home." I headed to the stairs, but when we got to the top, Sadie grasped my hand in hers and forced me to stop. "You can't go down the dead way," she whispered. "I have to go find Hugo, honey." I shook my head, trying to be patient. "I keep telling you, there's nothing scary about a dead end. I'll stop you, Mum. Sorry." She kissed my cheek, her thick eyelashes tickling my forehead as she did, before slipping down. She looked at me one more time, eyes as dark as her hair, and then she fell. "Sadie!" The scream tore from my lungs, and I charged down the stairs, trying to stop her tumble. She was always just out of reach, a million miles away. She hit the landing below, and I swallowed back the bile in my throat at the sight, eyes closed, bruises blooming on her body already, arm bent awkwardly. Nathan, quick, get an ambulance." He entered the hall, his face clenching. "What? Oh my." He grabbed the phone and dialed, pacing frantically, his footfalls echoing the patter of my heart. "Sadie, can you hear me? Honey, Mummy's here." I touched her neck, leaned down to feel the tickle of her breath on my cheek. "She's breathing, Nathan, but tell him to hurry." I wanted to pull her into my arms, but I couldn't move her for fear of making it worse. My tears splashed on her forehead, but still she didn't stir. Come on. Sorry, it's perfect timing. Later, after we were all home, I lay on the couch against Nathan's chest, a mug of hot chocolate in my hand. Twin sorrows ate at me. The missing dog, the child who was so desperate to stop me from looking for that dog that she would throw herself down the stairs. Something's wrong with her. You have to admit it now. She's always been a little quirky, but this, I don't even. I closed my eyes, but the image of her face, her eyes before she jumped, was there, burned into my brain. It's the baby. She's really jealous. Are you sure she didn't just trip? I mean, it could have been an accident. I pushed myself up and glared at him, the warmth of his chest no longer comforting. "You weren't there. I saw the look on her face, Nathan. She apologised before she jumped. She's only 6, Nathan. He shrugged, not willing to admit that there could be a problem. I shook my head, trying not to feel disgusted with him. "I'm going to go find Hugo. Keep an eye on her. I need some fresh air." I grabbed my coat and the dog lead before heading out the door. I didn't want to see Sadie right now. There were too many bruises on her face, and the cast looked too big for her small body to support. And heaven forbid if she woke. Who knew what she might do to stop me this time? The night air bit into my skin and I winced, focusing on the task ahead. Hugo needed me now. What on earth had forced him off the property was beyond me. He had never wondered before. "Hugo!" I called as I crossed the street and headed down dead way, as Sadie were to be believed. She'd always had an amazing imagination, but this was beyond weird. The streetlight above me sputtered and fizzled out, leaving me in a pool of darkness. I glanced back at the house. All the lights were on, which gave me some comfort, and until I turned back to the dead end and found it was now pitch black. I shuddered, unable to quell the feeling that something wasn't right. Yeah.
Such a great story. That was like my favourite story.
Mutual appreciations.
So, does our audience feel like horror recommendation? just now, or should we hold it to the end? In that case, let's move on to sort of where readers and writers can find how to read these days and where they can find calls for submissions for anthologies like Black Tales or for
You are the queen of submissions.
There's so many places that you can go and read fantastic horror and submit. How many horror writers are there in the audience? Are we more interested in like horror and Black Sabbath or reading? Okay, we got both. So finding places to submit to, there's a website called Submission Grinder, which is really fantastic, and you can put in, you can do a detailed search, and you can search by genre and pay rate, and then and word count, and then you can also see really useful things like what their acceptance rate is and what percentage of their rejections give feedback, so you can kind of tailor how you approach them. There's a bunch of short fiction online markets now that is so easy to submit to. You just go and fill in an online form and go, you write a really short cover letter that says this is my story, inspired. So it's really, really easy. There's some great podcast markets that you can submit to. There's ones like Pseudopod. I haven't had any success there, but they're mostly podcast. There's horror, and I know there's a Wellington writer, C.N. Scandrick, who's been published there a lot. Might write. He's on the podcast. Yeah. And then short fiction wise, a lot of the magazines, short fiction magazines, are free to read online, so not only really easy to submit to, but if you've got a little bit of time, you can go and read fantastic stories. So Pseudopod, that's also a podcast, but you can go and read the stories online. Strange Horizons has a lot of really great dark fiction, dark, Nightmare. So these are all mostly American short fiction magazines.
Yeah, lots of online magazines have a range, not just horror, but a bunch of things across the divide.
And then I guess more locally, so the closed now, they've just announced the table of contents, but like the Australian Horror Writers Association has a magazine called Midnight Echo. Is it annual? I think it's annual. And Lee Murray. This year, she's one of the more well-known New Zealand horror writers. And there's a bunch of small presses as well. So there's, I don't know, he's actually doing anymore.
No, he said he wasn't, but then he did some more. So I'm not sure.
So the publisher of this book was
Tales in the Well? Things in the Well.
Things in the Well. His name's Steve Dillon, and he's done a lot of really great charity anthologies. There's one for mental health foundations in New Zealand, but they did some for the bushfires and the ones that provide water for Tractor Streets Ray, which was last year that Road's running. So these they put out calls occasionally. Breach Zane, I haven't been doing much lately, but they're another good Australasian publisher. Yeah.
And you can always check out Year's Best because it has science fiction fantasy, but also horror, lots of horror elements in some of those stories.
So one of the anthology series that I published through Hero Press is an annual Year's Best of October New Zealand science fiction fantasy, and that includes some horror stories. So that's the same with I'll also add that these anthology call for submissions also get listed on places like Teotro, Submission Grinder. So you can, if you do your search for places that want to publish horror of up to 3,000 words, then those calls for anthology submissions will also appear with instructions on how to take those listeners.
What was the first one you mentioned?
Duotrope, D-U-O-T-R-O-P-E.
I know that a lot of people have a Duotrope, but the advantage of Submission Grinder is that it's free to do searches. graphs of all of the locked submissions.
Always such a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I'm a spreadsheet and graph geek. So you can, I find it really reassuring because you get rejected a lot when you put stories out like this, and it's quite comforting to see how many other people are getting rejected, and that it's not actually a sign that your story was crap. It's just that there are lots of great stories, and you have to pick the ones that will suit their particular market best. So you really need to just start with your dream markets and just keep going down and sending them out to every.
I think one of the lots of the people who read slush for this really discovered that reading slush is a fantastic way to see what works and what doesn't work. It's a really good way to see stories that aren't, because when you read on a magazine or any kind of book, they're polished, they're finished, they're complete, and that's not what a story looks like to begin with, or early on. Usually goes through some more editing after that. So reading slush for magazines or anthologies or anything like that can be a good way to learn what works and what doesn't work in quite a rapid way.
So just a bit of terminology, the slush pile
yes,
there it's a word used for the
all
bulk
of the
of
submissions.
unsolicited submissions. So people just sending in their work and it gets added to a huge file, or back in the old days like a pile of paper submissions, and things would be plucked out of it.
Yeah, it means reading a lot of things, but reading a lot is the best way to discover it. But if you're reading submissions rather than publications, you're getting to see it before it's in its final state. Sometimes that can actually be helpful for you. I always find it helpful for me. To kind of go, oh, that works and that doesn't work, and why is that good, why does that not work? Always,
Everyone is a numbers game, you just work write the best story you can and then just keep sending it out. Because even this one, like this is a charity anthology, so people would donate a few stories and not getting paid, and we've got 200 submissions for that. So you can imagine how many submissions that.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I quite liked your story, and it seems quite realistic. Is what inspired that story?
It is kind of going through and making tangible the kind of stresses and anxieties and mental health kind of it's like it's lived experience, I guess. The horror of teenagers. And especially that last scene with motherhood, like what was going through my mind was the loss of identity that you have is when you become a mother, and the feeling of helplessness when your child is, and that's where that image of the face, faceless. And I think you would probably know better than me, but the octopus mothers, they like give birth and then die. They just starve themselves to death. I think afterwards. there was something around that as well.
I know a worse story than that.
We're on YouTube.
Because you mentioned that it started from a childhood.
Yes.
Yeah, those letters and those.
So it is it's fairly autobiographical to be fair. So
It's
she actually,
really well
like
written.
later in the story, she starts writing, and there's some stuff in there about imposter syndrome. So it's working through the kind of anxieties and issues that I have felt at various points in my life, and making them just the horror of how that feels, and making it just super obvious and tangible.
And what about yours, Cassie?
that was my that was very much inspired by my daughter and my love of dogs. At the time, I had a dog called Carly, or she might have just passed away before that, so I had a really big bond with her. So she was really important to me. But my
She's got a
daughter,
great imagination, your daughter.
she does. She has a fantastic imagination.
She's also a horror fan.
She is also a hardcore horror fan. She really is. So she gave me the inspiration for the Dead Way, and then we were putting together. I think Dad was the first person to say, "Hey, let's write creepy stories about things kids said." I wrote the story really fast. I was probably pregnant, or had just given. Natalie was very, very little at that point, and so I've got 3 daughters, and the oldest one she would have been about 8ish, so just a little bit older than the kid in the book, but we had a lot of experiences. She has some, she's got ADHD and she's on the spectrum and can be quite literal about a lot of things. And so she knows she inspired the story. But she could always, she was always so, if she was convinced of something, she would dedicate herself to it wholeheartedly. And one of those things was always her love for me. I was her person and I was the only thing that mattered to her. So the story kind of plays on that, of the conflict of multiple children and children potentially feeling like they're not getting as much as they want, but also being protective. So lots of, just experiences. Lots of, I think some of the best horror comes from things that you that have touched on you in your life, or that you've come across, or that have had an impact. And parenthood has certainly had it.
But that book's about mental health.
It's not specifically about mental health. I think, some of the stories have.
It's all of the proceeds from it go to the mental health.
Yeah, so it was raising money for. There's a thing about how depression is the black dog. So that's where we came up with Tammy came up with the theme for the book. But it was really important the dogs don't die, because they're also such good companions to us and can be quite helpful when we're struggling to have that bond and that connection. So I'm quite proud of the book actually. When I read it, when you read so many stories and lots of them are not as good as they
It was quite hard to read 200 dogs.
It was. By the time you get to the end of it, you're like, oh my god, I don't even know what's in this book. When I read through the final proofing of it, I was like, oh, there's some amazing story. Like to take it from 200 down to this one, it's like, oh wow, there's some really fantastic stories in here.
Yeah. And without giving away, Cassie's story is a great example of building up that tension and then letting all the true horror of the story, like leaving it to the reader to go,
It is.
oh my gosh.
Sorry. At the end, that was the one my father read it, standing in my kitchen. He didn't sit down while he was reading it, and he got to the end and he said, that was awful, but I couldn't stop reading. So he doesn't like horror.
Well, they were 2 different stories though, because yours was more from her inside out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yours was from outside in, you know, like you were
It's
watching your
different
daughter
perspectives.
Yeah.
and experiencing what your daughter was going through and puzzling over it and everything. Why she was clinging to you and calling the thing the dead.
Yeah.
And the rest of the stories are just, it's very,
There's so much.
I think we even went out with the climate fiction in there, and sort of straight home run ones,
Probably a couple of
legend stories, and it was very
So was it just the 2 of you that wrote those stories?
No, this is from there's every story is by a different author, and they're from lots from New Zealand, some Australians, some from overseas, from all over the place. We've got submissions from just about everywhere. So a bunch of different authors, and we were both on the editing team.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really good to work on too.
Do we have any more questions at this stage?
So at the end of the story, or did you read the whole story?
we just
Part of it.
just read it teaser.
Because when you finished it, it was a real cliffhanger.
No, there's more.
Which would have
Tune in next week.
I'm really interested in how you've taken aspects of real life, because in my mind horror was Stephen King, or like the shack, or the holiday in the bush and then all the kids die. It's always I've been able to cope because I know it's basically impossible that a guy with a pumpkin on his head can rise from the dead and kill you. So I'm okay with that, and I'm actually a bit scared to even venture into reading because I feel things quite deeply. So so that's really, I'm really interested in my reaction to what you're saying, and that it can feel like non-fiction obviously until you get, I'm sure there are twists and all those things, but I'm really interested in this as a new exploration.
Horror's got a really long way from what we think of it, 20, 30 years ago, what we think of as horror back then, to now it's so much more diverse.
Freddy Krueger is all about the look, But then this is all really in the mind of the reader, which is so powerful.
And
Yeah.
I think the thing is with short stories, you can experiment a lot more and you can do new things.
Also, you don't feel like you have to explain absolutely everything. That's one of the things I love about short stories is that because you've got so few words, you can write a thing and not necessarily explain all of the things, and that can add to the horror or the anxiety or the fear or everything like that.
Yeah, but like, I think with movies and TV shows and novels, like they have to be marketable and they have to hit a niche that they already know exists and they people pour a lot of money into it.
Yeah.
But with short stories, you can, especially in something where you've got 17 stories, you can really take a chance and take some stories that have done something different.
Yeah.
I think people should read more short fiction. And they do. Short fiction is awesome.
Should we do that? Does anyone have a recommendation for us of something horrific? Yes.
I've got a movie.
Yeah.
You've probably seen it. It's one of my favourites. I haven't been able to get out of my head. Midsummer.
I haven't watched it yet.
It is Hart's beautiful and disturbing.
Oh, that's my favourite.
It is the most accurate depiction of an acid trip I've ever seen. Yeah, the horror in it isn't kind of in your face. It's a little bit more subtle. And one example is a guy gets skinned and stuffed with straw. And another one gets made into it's a Viking form of torture called the eagle. You can Google it. Apparently it's incredibly painful.
You're totally sold
Yeah.
me. Yeah, it's on Netflix, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm gonna watch that. I haven't got around to it yet. I keep hearing about it. But
There's a really good horror TV show on Netflix too. The Haunting of Hill House.
oh man, that was so good.
It was really
That
good.
was so gorgeous.
Yeah.
And they're doing it in
It's
a series
new, yeah.
as well. The Lion of Manor.
Yeah.
And I've got some of the cast from the first one, kind of different characters.
Yeah, I was reading about it the other day.
I can't wait. It was so beautiful. Like it was so well done. There was that scene when they're driving, that jump scare in the car with the I had a standing desk at the time and I was watching it and I literally, like it happened and I was like, I jumped to meet her. I was like, I know. And then my daughter watched it and she didn't even jump. I was like, but I jumped again. I was like, no, terrible. That's a beautiful horror.
I got two.
Yeah.
The first one is a Japanese book translated into English called The Summer of the Urume, based on a Japanese folktale of the ghost of a pregnant woman. It's a woman who believes that she's pregnant for like 2 years and her husband's been missing for longer than that. And the main character gets a Buddhist monk who doesn't actually believe in such things to go and like figure out what's wrong and cast out the spirits. It's really good. And the other is a movie, especially if you like the looking up in the mirror or something. It's the original Japanese version of The Eye, where the main character gets a corneal implant so she can see. And yeah.
I mean, the trees, like,
Oh,
the
yeah,
trees
that's
eat the
it.
people,
Yeah.
and I will see you here.
I'll classify that as. Cool.
It's really, really good.
The imagery was very identifiable with. That's why I like both the stories.
I missed it.
Because I like the stories because they were real. The images were real. I could relate to them in my own life and my own writing. I felt that you've got to have something that's really relatable to in real life. Otherwise, it sort of tends to go over everyone's head.
Yeah, it's the importance of that emotional connection.
Yeah, it has to be a
something.
connection, and that reason I think they both worked, both the stories, yes. It was almost, you could almost see it as non-fiction.
Yeah, do you know what? I have a friend who he prefers fiction with no specular stuff in it, but he loves reading my books. And he keeps saying to me, like, you could have just left that out. I'm like, no, that's integral. Like, for me, I need that other thing. But for him, he's like, you could have just left that bit out and it's still would be. Oh, I've got a friend who prefers books that are fully real without any extra elements. So he really likes my books, but he keeps telling me I could just leave out the ghosts or the demons or the whatever else. I'm like, but I really like those bits of it. So it's quite funny because you could, a lot of my stuff, you could take out the extra layer and still make it work as a book because so much is grounded in life. You know.
I think that makes the scarier.
Yeah, for me it
like,
does. Yeah.
And it's just
So that's great. We all get a copy?
I only had the one
Oh.
to give away.
Everything that you buy is just a that part of their definition. Of
I
their
did-
description.
did.
So
Yeah,
it's
we
like,
did.
Yeah.
We've got a couple minutes for questions or yeah. Any questions?
This is more, it's probably more of a general question about writing fiction rather than horror specifically. But you mentioned that it's okay for the tropes in the horror novels and stories. And I actually was working on a scene for a novel at the moment. I was told by my tutor that it is too much of a trope for the plot, like where it goes from there. And kind of going over it in my head. I just want to kind of know your advice for, you know, can you work a trope on the strength of character and keep going with it, or does it, you know, is it not so much working in other genres and things and, you know, look at other plots?
What genre is it?
It's just sort of contemporary women's fiction, but
Yeah.
It doesn't feel, it feels true to the character to go along that trope,
Yeah.
but then
I mean, personally, I don't think there is a problem with that, but is it a university paper or something?
no, it's working on novels, so.
Oh yeah, but you said a tutor.
Oh yeah, so it's a part of a getting started on my novel.
Right, yeah. I have a problem with some tutors. I took a class at university and it was a creative writing class, but really it was a literary class. And so when I was tuning stories about ghosts, I was not getting very good grades and he was very down on me about a lot of things. I think it depends on what you want to do with your book. Lots of books that are published have tropes in them. People do. There's a reason that they're there and they exist. I think if it's true to what your character would do, then that's the main thing. And if you can always find different ways to play with it. So maybe go and look up all of the different angles of the tropes or see examples where it's been done well versus examples where it hasn't been done well. I don't think necessarily throw something out because the person says that's too tricky. Yeah. Because I mean, you don't read a romance novel unless you know you're going to get a happy ending. So there's lots of different expectations and stuff. Yeah.
And I guess what they mean by trope as well.
Yeah.
Like, do they really mean that the trope was there? Sure, did they mean that they
Well,
could see, like, they predicted everything that would happen? Or
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's actually kind of
if you think about some novels, like you've got the enemies to lovers trope, but people buy books specifically for that reason. So there's lots of reasons why people buy. I buy haunted house books because I like reading about haunted houses. You know, if you don't give me a ghost or a possession in the end, I'm going to be really unhappy.
So I guess, then another way is to look at the audience that you're aiming your book and what their expectations are and whether that trope is
Whether it serves their
it's going to make them.
It was going to make the eyes light up.
Yes, I can't wait to see it.
I know we're just about out of time, but I just wanted to know briefly from the three of you, particularly you, Marie, when you're selecting a story, sci-fi or horror, what specifically do you hope to find?
I specifically hope to find a main character or characters who I can really connect with. If I care about them, I want whatever is happening to them, whether it's great or horrible, I want to see how they can get through it. And I want a story around that character that calls me something is happening, but it's not just the compelling story, it's how this character deals with it. That's what I have to
Yeah, so emotional resonance again. But I'm a geek and I need to have some like meaning or some commentary or something going on in the story as well. Like, there were quite a few like ghost stories that I was just like,
What's the point of this?
just a story. It didn't make me, and in fact that might have been emotional stuff as well.
But I think sometimes having that extra level, it just elevates a story. For even horror can be elevated to something more than just the grand slasher by the emotional impact. What was that? More than just stabbing, more than just blood. Yeah, when I'm looking at stories like that, it is main characters and that connection. I love beautiful language. I want to be swept into the story, and I want to forget about other things. Like if I'm reading a story and then I think about how I should go and do the dishes and I actually go and do the dishes, that's not the story. Like it might be a story for somebody else, but it's not my story. So I think everyone has different things that they look for. For me, it's their character, emotion, and just being swept up into
Especially on the first
Yes,
like,
yeah.
page also.
Yeah.
It needs to grab you right from the start.
Yeah.
I think that I've seen a lot of Twitter commentary from editors of like fancy and science fiction and stuff about like, please don't send me another story that starts with the character waking up.
It's like advice that we've been given for like 30 years now. No dreams to begin with. And then you fix them.
Oh yeah, it's like,
Yeah, don't tell me about the weather. Yeah. Any other questions? Good. Yay!
keep hovering at the
Pick us out.
No pressure. You guys have been awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving
There's too much laughter going on. But Marie, thank you very much for facilitating it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we've got
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy. Go stretch your legs, have some lunch, and shake it. 1 o'clock.
whole glass of water. Down the way. No, I don't.
Of course, I was going to ask you anyway.
No, and I was like, I do have that image of like such form, like you have to dissect a cow's eye and you like see it, see the scalpel, like so I'm pretty sure that has something to do.
We had a really interesting experience with dissection rabbit, so.
Oh, interesting.
Workshopping each other.
Lots of frogs. Yeah.
Yes.
Really,
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm a bit short of a skirt
So fine. Have some items they can hang out together.
I was given one as well, and I was sitting outside yesterday. The woman came up, hadn't been to the festival, she just came past, and she said, "Oh, you've got one of those." She said she planted it 2 years ago, and it's 8 feet high already.
Whoa, okay, I'm going to be really careful about where I plant mine.
I got one at home already, but it stays potted.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. I'm not sure where I can put an 8-foot tree in my house.
Well, it would make its own space.
This is true.
What?
Yeah, you enjoying
Yes, yeah, I am this time. I think they may be.
Yeah. It's very cool.
Yeah, I am enjoying it actually because first of all, I didn't just sit down because I was
running around
exhausted.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
But this time I did done the first
Yeah.
and not anything else. I made just magnets
Yeah.
and think up questions and speak it. And write it down and then find that I've run out of time. Just to ask them.
Yeah, it's always hard to know exactly how much time you need for questions at the end.
Yeah.
Kind of go, yeah, sitting around for half an hour to the cards.
Yeah, there is that. I don't know. There needs to be, but sometimes I think people hesitate, whether it's shyness. But for me, I hesitate because I'm hoping someone else will ask questions. And then I can cross out some of mine. And then ask the one that's left, you know.
Stand up with your list, doesn't
I was dying to ask about the Bible straight away.